The alien ship did not land with fire or noise. It came down slowly, like a leaf falling from a tree, and touched the ground outside Seoul without making a single sound. There were no explosions, no dramatic lights, no crowd of screaming people. Just a long silver shape settling into the grass of the designated landing field, while a row of UN officials stood nearby in suits, hands folded, trying to look calm. Diho stood at the end of that row. He was not a soldier, not a scientist. He was a liaison officer, a man whose job was to stand between two very different things and make sure neither one caused a disaster. He had done this job for 11 years, mostly between governments, mostly in rooms with bad coffee and worse air conditioning. This was the first time the two sides were from different planets. He watched the door of the ship open. He watched the delegation come out. They were tall, pale. Their bodies were thin in a way that looked uncomfortable, like something that had been stretched. They had large eyes, dark, wide, unblinking, and they moved with a kind of slow, deliberate care, as if every step was being calculated before it was taken. Their leader came first. His name, translated into something a human mouth could say, was Vel. He was the head of the Veth Dominion Research Assembly, the most respected academic institution in the Galactic Conclave. He had written 14 books. He had studied 40 civilizations. He had never, in all his long career, seen anything quite like Earth. Diho stepped forward and gave a small bow. Vel tilted his head in return. The translator device between them hummed softly. "We are grateful for the welcome," Vel said. His voice came out flat, and even through the device, all the alien sound stripped away and replaced with clean, neutral syllables. "We hope our presence is not an inconvenience." "Not at all," Diho said. "We've been expecting you." That was true. The Galactic Conclave had been requesting access to Earth's historical records for over 2 years. Not military technology, not resources, not territory. Records, specifically war records. They wanted to understand why humanity kept them. Every other civilization in the Conclave, upon reaching a certain level of peace and development, had destroyed or buried the documentation of their violent past. They considered it a mark of maturity, a sign that a species had moved on. Humans had built museums. This was, to the Conclave, extremely strange. Yuna met them at the first stop, the Korean War Memorial in central Seoul. She was the cultural historian assigned to guide the delegation, a compact woman with short hair and a calm face that hid the fact that she had been up since 4 in the morning preparing. She had spent 3 weeks thinking about how to explain this place to beings who had never lost a war because they had never really fought one, not the way humans had. The memorial was quiet in the early morning. The long black wall stretched across the open ground, covered in names. Thousands of names, carved into stone, permanent, patient. Vel walked along it slowly, his scanner humming, his wide eyes moving across the surface. "These are the dead?" he asked. "Some of them," Yuna said, "the ones we could identify." Vel paused. Why preserve their names? Diho, who had been walking a few steps behind, answered before Yuna could. He did not plan to speak. The words just came. "So we never forget the cost," he said. Vel turned to look at him. The alien's expression did not change. His face was not built for the kind of movement human faces made, but something shifted in his posture. He stood very still for a moment. Then he turned back to the wall and continued scanning. That afternoon, Yuna gave the first formal briefing inside the UN Cultural Center. She had prepared a presentation that covered human military history in broad strokes. Not every war, not every battle, but enough to give the delegation a shape, a sense of scale. She started with early tribal conflict and moved forward through centuries. Bronze Age armies, medieval sieges, the First and Second World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. The long grinding conflicts of the early 21st century, nuclear deterrence, cyber warfare, the slow evolution of how humans fought and why. Vel's instruments began producing errors halfway through. His assistant, A younger alien whose translated name was something close to Pell leaned over and whispered something. Vel held up a thin hand. He wanted to hear the rest. When Yuna finished, there was a long silence. "The volume," Vel said finally. "The variety, the frequency." He paused. "No other civilization in our records has engaged in conflict at this scale across this many centuries, and still," he stopped, searched for the word, continued. "Yes," Yuna said simply. "It is not rational," Vel said, "not as an insult, as an observation, as a man of science nodding something that did not fit his model." "Probably not," Yuna agreed, "but here we are." After the briefing, the delegation requested access to the military archives. The UN had expected this. There had been weeks of internal argument about how much to share, long meetings, raised voices, people drawing lines on whiteboards. In the end, they granted partial access. Historical records only. No current operational data, no weapon specifications, no active defense schematics. Just history. Vel accepted this without complaint. He seemed, if anything, relieved, as if the weight of what he was already reading was enough. Diho escorted the delegation back to their temporary quarters that evening, a wing of a government facility on the edge of the city, quiet and clean and carefully prepared. As Vel reached the door, he stopped and turned back. "One question," he said. "Of course," Diho said. "The names on the wall, the soldiers who died, did they know before they went that they might die?" Diho considered the question seriously. "Most of them," he said, "yes." Vel was quiet for a moment, and they went anyway. "Yes." Another pause. Vel nodded slowly, as if filing the answer somewhere deep inside himself. "We will need more time," he said. "There is more here than we expected." He went inside. The door closed. Diho stood in the hallway for a moment, alone, listening to the hum of the building around him. Somewhere outside, Seoul was going on with its evening traffic, food stalls, people heading home. The whole enormous, ordinary weight of a civilization that had survived everything it had ever faced. He thought about the wall, the names, the cost. Then he straightened his jacket and went to file his evening report. The simulations kept failing. Vel had been running them for 6 days straight, barely resting, barely eating the bland nutrient paste his team had brought from the ship. He sat in the center of the research room, a space the UN had cleared out for him, large and quiet, with extra power ports installed along the walls, and he stared at the results of his models with the focused, unhappy expression of a man who knew he was missing something important but could not figure out what it was. The simulations were straightforward in design. His team had built them over decades to analyze historical conflicts from other civilizations across the conclave. You fed in the numbers, troop counts, supply lines, territorial value, resource cost, casualty rates, and the model produced a rational outcome. It showed what a logical species would do: when to advance, when to retreat, when to surrender, when to negotiate. Every civilization in the conclave's records had, eventually, behaved the way the model predicted. They fought when the numbers made sense. They stopped when the numbers stopped making sense. Humans did not do this. Vel pulled up the Battle of Stalingrad and ran it again. The German forces had been massive, well-supplied, and strategically superior at the start. The logical outcome, according to every metric his model used, was a Soviet withdrawal within 3 months. Instead, the Soviets had fought street by street, building by building, room by room, for nearly 6 months, in brutal winter conditions, with catastrophic losses on both sides, until the German army was not just defeated but broken in a way it never fully recovered from. The model gave this outcome a probability of less than 2%. It had happened anyway. He ran Thermopylae, 300 soldiers holding a narrow mountain pass against an army of hundreds of thousands. The rational decision was retreat. The actual decision was to stand and die, buying time for a larger Greek force to prepare. The model called this irrational. History called it the moment that saved Western civilization. He ran Incheon, the Korean War landing that Deho's own grandfather had told his father stories about. A surprise amphibious attack considered nearly impossible by military experts at the time, with tides and terrain and timing all working against it, executed anyway, and it had completely reversed the course of the war. Every time the model failed, every time the humans had done the thing that should not have worked, for reasons that should not have been enough, and it had changed everything. Vel finally pushed back from his desk, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, Seoul moved. Cars, people, the slow blinking of city lights coming on as evening arrived. A food cart on the corner below was doing steady business. A group of children in school uniforms crossed the street together. An old man sat on a bench reading a physical newspaper, actual paper, folded in his hands. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked completely, stubbornly, defiantly ordinary. He did not understand these people. He had studied 40 civilizations, and he did not understand these people at all. Jun-ho arrived the next morning. He was a retired general, broad-shouldered, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had stopped being impressed by things a long time ago. The UN had brought him in as a military consultant, someone who could speak to the delegation in plain terms about what the historical data actually meant from the inside, from the perspective of someone who had worn a uniform. He walked into Vel's research room, looked around at the screens and the stacks of translated documents, and sat down across from the alien without any visible concern. "You wanted to talk about Chosin," he said. "Yes," Vel said. He pulled up the file. November 1950, American Marines, outnumbered by approximately 10 to 1, surrounded, supply lines cut, temperature reaching minus 35 degrees. My model gives them no viable path to survival. And yet, Jun-ho agreed. He leaned back. They fought their way out, 17 days, 78 miles of mountain road, fighting the whole way. How, Vel said, it was not quite a question, it was something else, something closer to a demand. Jun-ho thought about it for a moment. Because going forward was the only direction they had left, he said. They didn't think about the whole mountain, they thought about the next 100 meters, and then the 100 meters after that. The translator went silent for 11 seconds. Vel stared at the general. Jun-ho stared back, patient, unbothered. "That is not a military strategy," Vel said finally. "No," Jun-ho said, "it's something else." That evening, Vel transmitted his preliminary report to the conclave. He spent a long time writing it, choosing his words carefully, trying to describe what he had found in terms his colleagues would understand. He wrote about the volume of human conflict, the continuity of it across centuries, the repeated pattern of forces that should have been destroyed somehow not being destroyed. He wrote about Chosin. He wrote about the 11-second silence. At the end, he added a line he had been turning over in his mind all day. "Their defeats read like victories. Their retreats read like tactics. We do not have a category for this." Back at the UN facility in a different room, Deho was reviewing the daily security logs, a routine task, something he did every evening with a cup of tea and no particular urgency. He scrolled through the list of scans and access requests from the alien delegation. Historical archive accesses, cultural database queries, language translation requests, all normal, all expected. Then one entry that was not expected. A scan request timestamped at 2:14 in the morning, cross-referenced against a signal that matched the frequency range of current military satellite infrastructure. Not historical, not archived, current. Deho set down his tea. He read the entry again, then a third time. The scan had been brief, less than 4 seconds, and had not successfully retrieved anything, but it had been attempted. Vel, or someone on his team, had reached past the historical records they had been given access to and tried to look at something they had not been given access to. Deho did not raise an alarm. He did not confront the delegation. He closed the log, opened a separate secure channel, and typed a short internal report. He marked it for the eyes of his direct supervisor and no one else, and he flagged it with a single word in the subject line. Noted. Then he finished his tea, turned off the light, and went to bed. But he did not sleep well. He lay in the dark and thought about the wall of names, about the cost, about the fact that every name on that wall had once been a person who also went to bed one night not quite sure what the next morning would bring. He thought about Junho's words from the briefing recording he had reviewed that afternoon. Going forward was the only direction they had left. He stared at the ceiling. He understood now that this was no longer just a research visit. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning. It came through the official Conclave diplomatic channel, a frequency that had been established years ago for exactly this kind of communication, formal and verified, with authentication codes that took 3 separate systems to confirm. The UN communications team received it at 6:47 a.m., ran the standard checks, and had a translated copy on the Secretary General's desk by 7:15. By 8:00, an emergency session of the Security Council had been called. By 8:30, the room was full. Diho was not supposed to be in that room. He was a liaison officer. His clearance covered coordination work, not top-level council sessions. But his supervisor had pulled him in quietly, without explanation, and pointed him to a seat along the side wall where the support staff sat. He took it without asking questions. The Secretary General read the message aloud. Her voice was steady, her face was not. The Galactic Conclave, speaking on behalf of its 15 remaining member species, 2 had already quietly declined to sign, formally requested that humanity agree to the following terms: a complete halt to all weapons development programs, submission to a conclave-administered population review, and acceptance of permanent conclave oversight on all future space expansion. Non-compliance within 90 days would result in full economic and resource isolation from every conclave-controlled region of space, which covered, by current mapping, approximately 63% of the accessible galaxy. They called it a guidance framework. The room was silent when she finished reading. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of fear, something else. Something that sat very still and very heavy, like a stone that had been placed on the table and was not going to be moved. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, someone laughed. It was a short laugh, not a happy one, just the kind of sound that comes out of a person when something is so absurd that the body doesn't know how else to respond. But once it happened, something shifted. A few more people exhaled. Someone else made a low sound that was almost a laugh. The tension did not break exactly, but it changed shape. The Secretary General looked down at the document in her hands. She looked up at the room. She said, "Recommendations." Junho, who had been brought into the session as a defense consultant, was sitting 3 seats to Diho's left. He had not laughed. He had not moved at all. He was looking at the far wall with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. The discussion went on for 2 hours. There were arguments for measured response, for negotiation, for buying time. There were concerns about the economic impact. There were careful, professional voices laying out every possible path. Diho listened to all of it. He watched the room. He watched Junho, who still had not said anything. At the end of the 2 hours, the Secretary General called for a formal position. The Security Council voted. The response to the conclave was drafted, reviewed, and transmitted that same afternoon. 3 words, officially recorded, sent through the same verified diplomatic channel the message had arrived on. Ask us again. Vel received the response in his quarters. He read it once. He read it again. He set down his translation device and sat very still for a long time. 2 days later, Yuna stood in front of a camera. She had requested the broadcast slot herself, routed through the UN's open communications array, the one that the Conclave's monitoring systems were known to observe. She was not in a studio. She was in a conference room with plain walls and a single light. She was wearing the same jacket she wore to the memorial. She had no notes. She spoke for 41 minutes. She did not shout, she did not make threats. She spoke in the same calm, clear voice she used when giving a university lecture. She went through human history from the beginning, not a summary, not a highlights reel, but a methodical, patient account. She named empires. She gave dates. She described in plain language every major external force that had ever attempted to conquer a race or fundamentally end human civilization. The Mongol invasions, the colonial period, the world wars, the nuclear standoffs, the slow, grinding ideological conflicts of the 20th century. And then for each one, she noted the current status. The Mongol Empire, gone. The Third Reich, gone. The Soviet Union, gone. Every force, every ideology, every power that had ever looked at humanity and decided it was something that could be controlled, redirected, or removed. Gone, or transformed beyond recognition, or simply absorbed into the long record of things that had tried and failed. Humanity still here. She did not say, and you will be next. She did not need to. The math was on the screen behind her, plain as the names on the memorial wall. When the broadcast ended, the UN communications team reported that the conclave monitoring frequency had gone completely silent for the first time since contact was established. No response, no acknowledgement, just silence. In his quarters, Vel had watched the entire broadcast without moving. Pell had come in halfway through and stood by the door, also watching. Neither of them spoke. When it was over, Vel turned off the screen. He looked at his research files, weeks of work, thousands of data points, models and simulations, and carefully organized reports. He thought about the 11-second silence after Junho described Chasen. He thought about the 3-word response from the Security Council. He thought about Diho at the memorial, speaking without planning to, because the words just came. He began, quietly, to pack his personal materials. Pell watched him. "Are we leaving?" he asked. "I am preparing," Vel said. He did not specify for what. Back in the council facility, after the session had ended and most people had gone home, Diho found Junho in a small room off the main corridor, standing by a window with a cold cup of coffee. The old general was looking out at the city. The lights of Seoul spread out in every direction, bright and indifferent to the fact that 63% of the accessible galaxy had just threatened to cut them off. "They read everything we gave them," Diho said. "All the history, all the battles, and they still sent that message." Junho did not turn from the window. He took a slow sip of his cold coffee. "They read our history the way you read about someone else's nightmare," he said. "Interesting, safe, far away." He paused. "They never understood that the people in those stories are still in the room." He finally turned. He looked at Diho with tired, steady eyes. "Let them read the next chapter," he said. He set down his cup and walked out. Diho stood there alone for a moment. Outside, Seoul kept going. Ordinary, stubborn, bright. The city of a people who had been here before any of this, who had rebuilt from rubble more than once, who had carved names into stone so the cost would never be forgotten. He thought about what came next. He was not afraid. He was not certain either. But he was ready in the way that a people who remember every war they have ever survived are always, quietly ready. He turned off the light and went to work. 3 weeks after the ultimatum, 2 things happened on the same day. The first was a quiet diplomatic contact request, received through a secondary channel that the conclave rarely used. It came from 2 of the 17 member species, the Marin and the Durath, and it did not go through the main conclave diplomatic frequency. It came separately, privately, with a note that it was not an official conclave communication and should not be treated as one. It asked simply whether Earth was open to a private conversation. The UN passed it to Diho's team. He read it twice and then called Yuna. "What do you know about the Marin and the Durath?" he asked. She thought for a moment. The Marin had a near-extinction event about 400 years ago, some kind of internal collapse, disease, famine, resource war all at once. They almost didn't make it. The Durath were invaded twice in their early development by a larger species and had to fight for their independence over about 2 centuries. She paused. Why? Because they're the only 2 species in the conclave that have actually had to fight to survive, Diho said. There was a short silence on the line. Oh, Yuna said. The second thing that happened that day was that Rena found something. She was 26 years old, a signals analyst who had been assigned to Diho's intelligence division 3 months before the alien delegation arrived. She was not senior. She was not famous. She was the person who sat in a small room with 3 monitors and a pair of headphones and listened to frequencies that most people did not know existed, looking for patterns that most people would not recognize. She was very good at it. The signal she found had been passing through a conclave relay frequency for 6 days. It was heavily compressed, layered under routine administrative traffic, and designed to look like background noise. For 6 days, it had looked like background noise to everyone else. On the 7th day, Rena pulled it apart. It took her 4 hours to decode enough of it to understand what she was reading. When she did, she sat very still for approximately 40 seconds. Then she printed the document. She did not send it through the secure network. She folded the pages, put them in her jacket pocket, walked down 3 hallways, and knocked on Diho's office door. He opened it. She handed him the pages without saying anything. He read them standing in the doorway. She watched his face. It did not change much. He was the kind of man whose face had learned to stay calm, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly as he reached the 2nd page, and she saw his eyes stop moving at the bottom of the 3rd. He looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Conclave Relay Frequency 7-4, she said. "It was buried, 6 days old." He looked back down at the pages. "Does anyone else have this?" "No." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." He read the whole thing twice more, sitting at his desk. Rena sat across from him and waited. Outside the window, the city was going through its afternoon, completely unaware that the document on his desk was a record of a meeting between senior conclave military planners and several of the hawkish member species, held 11 days ago, in which the economic isolation threat had been explicitly described as a delay tactic. The actual plan was not isolation. The actual plan was to wait until the human orbital defense network was fully mapped, then move to a position that would allow simultaneous disruption of communication satellites and early warning systems. After that, a concentrated strike, not an invasion, not an occupation, something quieter and faster and more permanent. They had not intended to negotiate, not from the beginning. The ultimatum was theater. The 90-day window was a measurement tool. They wanted to see how humanity responded, what it mobilized, where it moved its assets. Diho put the pages down. He made one phone call. He kept it short. "Tell Junho we were right," he said, and hung up. What neither Diho nor Rena knew yet was that the decoded message had not reached them purely by accident. Vel had not simply forgotten to cover his tracks. He had, in his careful way, left exactly one thread loose, one signal slightly less buried than the others, routed through a frequency he knew Rena's team monitored, timed to be found before the planning window closed. He had not contacted Earth directly. He had too much pride for that, and perhaps too much fear of what it would mean for him. But he had been a researcher for 40 years, and he had one principle that had survived his entire career without compromise. Data should reach the people who need it. He recorded his final personal log on the evening of the same day. He sat alone in his quarters, the packing mostly done, and he spoke into his recorder in his own language, not for translation, not for any audience, just for the record. He said that he had come to Earth to understand why humans preserved their wars. He said he understood now. He said they preserved them not because they were proud of the violence, but because they needed to remember the exact shape of every time something tried to destroy them and failed. He said that the conclave had made the oldest kind of mistake, the kind that came from studying something at a safe distance and never understanding it from the inside. He said that the Marin and the Durath had been right to step away. They knew something the others did not. They knew what it felt like to nearly stop existing. At the end, he said, "This is our error. It cannot be undone." He turned off the recorder. He sat in the quiet for a long time. In Diho's division, the decoded document moved quickly through the right channels. Within 12 hours, Junho was in a secure briefing room with the Defense Council, walking them through the timeline. He used no dramatic language. He read the relevant sections, pointed to the dates, and laid out the strategic implications the same way he would brief a class of officer candidates, plainly, specifically, without noise. When he finished, he looked around the room. "They spent weeks studying every war we ever fought," he said. "Every ambush, every last stand, every time we turned a losing position into something else. They read all of it." He paused. "And they still thought we wouldn't see this coming." No one in the room said anything for a moment. Rena was not in that briefing. She was back in her small room, headphones on, 3 monitors running, already scanning for the next signal. She had done her part. She knew there would be more to find. She was the kind of person who did not wait to be told to keep going. Diho stood outside the briefing room afterward in the hallway, rolling his shoulders slowly. He thought about Vel, the alien's careful eyes, the 11-second silence, the slow, reluctant understanding that had built up in those wide, dark pupils over weeks of reading human history. He thought about the final log he had not yet heard, would not hear for months, and could not have known existed. He thought about the names on the wall. He thought about what it meant to keep a record of a cost. Then he went back to work. There was a defense grid to finish coordinating, a set of orbital positioning reports to review, and a very small window of time in which to make sure that when the conclave fleet finally came, and it was coming, the decoded message made that clear. It would arrive to find something it had not prepared for. Not a larger force, not a more advanced one. Just one that had been expecting it. That had always been the difference. The conclave fleet dropped out of transit at 3:12 hours, 14 minutes ahead of the window Rena's team had projected. 13 warships, long, angular, dark, built for dominance rather than speed, the kind of vessels designed to arrive and make the act of arriving feel like a statement. They held position just beyond the lunar boundary, engines running at low power, systems scanning. Their formation was precise, practiced. The arrangement of a fleet that had done this before, shown up at the edge of a world, and waited for that world to understand what it was looking at. Diho was already at his station when the proximity alert came in. He had been there for 2 hours. Most of his team had been there for 3. The overnight shift had never gone home. The Orbital Coordination Center was a wide room on the upper level of a defense station in low Earth orbit, built 10 years ago during what the planners had called, with deliberate understatement, a preparedness expansion. Banks of screens lined the curved walls. Every screen had a person in front of it. The room was quiet in the way that rooms full of very focused people are quiet, not empty, not still, but concentrated, purposeful. Rena was at her station in the far corner, headphones on, both hands moving. She had not looked up when the alert sounded. She had been monitoring conclave frequencies for 18 hours, and she already knew the fleet was there 40 seconds before the proximity sensors confirmed it. She had already flagged it and moved on to the next layer of signal traffic, looking for communication patterns, looking for anything that suggested the fleet was receiving new instructions or coordinating with an asset they hadn't identified yet. She found nothing. She kept looking. Diho pulled up the tactical display. 13 contacts, confirmed positions, no immediate movement. He noted the time, noted the formation, and opened a channel to the ground. Junho answered on the second tone. He was not in a command center. He was sitting in a chair in a small operations room on the ground level of the Defense Ministry, the same chair he had been sitting in for most of the past week, with a cold cup of coffee and a half-eaten rice ball on the table beside him. He looked at the screen with the same expression he brought to everything, steady, quiet, entirely prepared to be unsurprised. "They're here," Diho said. "I see them," Junho said. "Hold position." "Yes, sir." The waiting began. What the Conclave fleet found when it arrived was not chaos. It was not a scramble of ships being hastily repositioned, not a desperate reorientation of defense systems, not the expected signature of a civilization that had just realized it was out of time. What its scanning arrays picked up instead was a grid, calm, organized, already in place. Human defense platforms sitting in prepared positions. Response vessels at ready status. Communication networks running clean and quiet. No interference, no static, no signs of the internal confusion that preceded a civilization's collapse into panic. The Conclave fleet commander, a senior Veth strategist whose translated title meant something close to admiral, studied the readout for a long time. He ran the scan again. He called his tactical team forward and had them run it independently. The results were the same. They had war-gamed this arrival dozens of times. Every model had shown the same thing. Humanity would see the fleet, understand the implication, and enter a period of internal breakdown, political arguments, military repositioning, key figures pulling in different directions. The Conclave had planned to use that breakdown window to establish a communication dominance position before any real resistance could be organized. Instead, the defense grid was already organized. The Admiral sent no immediate communication. He held position and thought. Back on the orbital station, Diho watched the Conclave fleet sit still and felt the silence of it like a physical weight. 1 hour passed, then 2. His team worked. Rena's hands kept moving. Reports came in from the ground, from the other orbital platforms, from the 2 Marin and Durath diplomatic vessels that had quietly repositioned to a neutral observation point outside the conflict zone. Watching, not participating, their presence a quiet signal of where their loyalties had settled. At 4 hours and 17 minutes, the Conclave flagship transmitted. One message, clean and formal, routed through the standard diplomatic channel. "We wish to negotiate." Diho read it. He read it again. He sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath, not of relief, not of triumph, something quieter, something that did not have a clean name. He typed the response himself, coordinates for a neutral meeting point, a timestamp 48 hours out, standard diplomatic protocols. Calm, professional, without any edge of victory in the language, just the next step offered plainly. He transmitted it and turned back to his screens. Somewhere below him in the operations room, Junho received the notification that the message had been sent. He read it. He set down his phone. He looked out the narrow window at the dark sky above Seoul, still dark at this hour, stars faint through the city light, and he stayed there for a long time without moving. He thought about the Conclave researchers who had come here and walked through the memorial and read the archives. He thought about Vel's face at the wall of names, the wide dark eyes moving across the stone. He thought about every battle and every report they had read. Every time a human force had been surrounded, outgunned, stripped of everything but the decision to keep going. He thought about what it meant that after reading all of it, they had still come here expecting to find a civilization that would blink. He shook his head slowly, not in anger, in something closer to a tired kind of understanding. They had read the records. They had studied the numbers. They had run the simulations and built their models and produced their reports. But they had read it all from the outside, the way you read about rain without ever having been cold and wet and still decided to keep walking. You could not learn that from a document. 48 hours later, In a neutral station positioned between the two fleets, the first formal negotiation session began. Diho led the human delegation. He wore the same plain jacket he always wore. He brought Yuna because history was still relevant. He brought Rena because signals were still running. He sat down across from the conclave representatives, and he was courteous and calm, and did not waste a single word. The negotiations would take months. They would be difficult. Not everything would be won. But the 90-day ultimatum was gone, dissolved back into space like something that had never quite had the weight it thought it did. The conclave fleet returned to transit 1 week later, quietly, without ceremony. On the day it left, Yuna went back to the memorial in Seoul. She went in the early morning before the visitors arrived, when the light was still low and gray and the city had not yet fully woken up. She walked along the wall slowly. She did not read every name. There were too many for that, but she read some of them, the ones near where she always stopped. She let her hand rest on the stone. She thought about what the wall was. Not a monument to loss, not a display of grief, something harder and quieter than both of those things. A record kept on purpose, maintained with care, passed down through every generation that came after, so that no one who stood here would ever forget what it had cost to still be standing here. Every name a promise. Every promise kept. She stood there in the gray morning light for a long time. The city began to wake up around her, the first sounds of traffic, the smell of something warm from a shop somewhere nearby, the ordinary, unstoppable motion of a civilization going about its day. She took her hand off the stone. She walked back out into the world. They had come to understand humanity by studying its violence. They had cataloged the wars, counted the dead, run the numbers, built the models. They had done everything a careful and intelligent species could do to understand what they were looking at. What they had never understood, what no species that had never truly come close to ending could ever understand from the outside, was that every name on every wall was not a record of loss. It was a record of survival. And humanity had been keeping that record for a very long time. It was not finished yet.
The view is magnificent. It is a reminder of our purpose.